here in the process. So I'm very pleased to be here. I'm looking forward to both today's conversation as well as some of the conversations tomorrow. And I know tomorrow evening we're going to talk very explicitly about poverty. I'm going to talk a little more broadly today about some issues relating to the role of government. I come at this, as you know from hearing my bio, as an economist. I'm not a theologian by any stretch of the imagination. And my interest in this particular topic is partly, as an economist, you can't be interested in markets without immediately being interested in what it is that government does. I also have a rather deep passion about issues of public policy and the translation of economic issues into policy issues. Served as dean of a policy school for the last 8 years. I myself have worked in government, and if you work in government, you spend a lot of time thinking about, how are you effective and how aren't you effective and how do you make this work better? And I spend a good amount of my time in church and in religious-based organizations as well. And from that position, have spent some amount of time trying to think about what does religion have to say about civil, secular life together, as well as about our economic life together. So it's out of all those perspectives that I sort of want to engage you in this afternoon's conversation. So what I plan to do is, let's see, get this going right. I want to talk about 3 different models of what it is that government does, and spend much of my time on that, but then I want to end by thinking a little bit at least about whether there is a particularly religious perspective on this that is appropriate or interesting. And does it make any difference that I as a Christian think about these issues as opposed to I as an economist think about these issues? And I will be talking out of an explicitly Christian background because that is where I come from, but would be more than delighted in the process of conversation to engage in some discussion about whether any of this expands into other faiths and other conversations as well. Okay? A few caveats. I am going to ignore arguments for government and the role of government in non-market or non-democratic nations. It's not that we can't have an interesting conversation about the role of government in a communist or a more socialistic society, but that's not where we are. We are in a market-based society, and therefore that's what I'm going to talk about today. Secondly, I'm going to ignore the federalism issues, which are the issues about whether it should be the federal, state, or local government that does this. I'm going to talk about government as a monolith. In reality, we can have a great conversation about what are the appropriate roles of different levels of government and how do they interact. And for the sake of time and simplicity today, I'm just going to put that aside. All right. So as Americans, we live in a market society. We live in the midst of labor markets, of financial markets, of supermarkets, of information markets. These markets organize large parts of our lives. They affect such things as the choices we make about paid work, the wages we receive, the prices we pay at the gas pump or the grocery store, and the pension benefits, if any, that we receive upon retirement. As people of faith, we always confront the question, what does God demand of our lives? As participants in market society, we therefore have to ask this question, what is it that how is it that we serve God in the midst of a market economy? Okay? So that's sort of the fundamental underlying question here. Now, I'm an economist, and it should not come as a surprise to anyone in the room that I happen to believe in markets. I believe in the power of markets and of the market economy as a very effective way to organize economic life. And I'm sure we'll come back and talk about this a little in question and answer. When markets work effectively, they're efficient, they stimulate productivity, they help allocate resources with minimal administrative costs. Through competition, there's an incentive to keep prices low. They encourage entrepreneurship. They encourage economic growth. And indeed, the transformation of rural subsistence economies in the U.S. and elsewhere around the world into market economies has been one of the primary causes for reduced poverty. So I say I believe in markets. I believe in what they do. I think markets are incredibly important in terms of poverty reduction. However, markets do not always function effectively. That will surprise no one in the room except the economists. They don't satisfactorily resolve all of the distributional questions that exist in society. Hence, the interesting questions here for those of us who care about redistribution, which is inevitably a question that one comes to when you're thinking about poverty, is what is the role of government? How does the role of government interact with the role of markets? All right. Keep going. Okay. So first view, in terms of the role of government, let me sort of lay out three different views, and I want to talk about, what is this particular perspective, how do you get at it, and what are both the reasons to argue for it as well as the reasons to argue against it, because every one of these has both its proponents as well as its people who will argue against it at some level or another. So this is the argument for government out of economic theory, that government's role is to correct the market, not to and that there are situations of market failure, a formal term in economics, in which government actually can improve market outcomes, all right? So there are times when markets fail, when the economic circumstances that are necessary for the market solution acting by itself to be the right solution, to be effective, to be efficient, are simply not present. And there are a number of examples that I list here. All of you who've had Economics 101 have in one form or another studied these. The economists can go to sleep for a moment, but let me just run through these. One of the classic examples here is lack of complete information. If the buyer and seller know different things, it turns out that markets may not work very well because you get people acting on less than full and complete information. You have asymmetric market power often in many cases where one side of the market knows something the other side doesn't. There's a role here for the government to come in and essentially equalize the information in one form or another. So you get everything from the requirements that you have to date milk cartons, so everybody knows when they buy milk exactly how long it's been sitting on the shelf, to requirements that the SEC require all companies that trade on the New York Stock Exchange to issue certain types of information, publicly available information, so when people buy stocks they sort of know something in a consistent way about a whole variety of companies. There's a lot of ways in which governments regulate the flow of information, often designed to increase information to both sides of the market, okay? Secondly, the presence of monopoly power. There are a number of situations which we often think about as almost natural monopolies, where it's very expensive to get into a particular market, or the nature of the product is such that it's often provided by only one major provider. For many, many years, we thought that phone companies were like this, where you had a large network of wires that one company maintained, and once that company laid down those wires, it wasn't very effective for another company to lay another row of wires right next to it. Technologies have changed, and it turns out that phones, which might once have been a natural monopoly, no longer are. Everybody runs on the same wires or runs through the air through satellites, and that monopoly has disappeared. But in exchange, other monopolies presumably grow up, and there's a whole set of theories around government regulation and when indeed the government should regulate markets in order to limit the presence of monopolies or to force a natural monopoly to actually price at a more efficient level to have lower prices. And a whole bunch of, a lot of people in economics who work on that topic in a variety of different ways. Thirdly, there's what's called the presence of externalities. This is when the exchange between a buyer and seller involves more than just the well-being of those two. So a lot of things, if Doug offers me a can of corn for sale and I buy it, none of the rest of you care very much whether I make that sale or whether I don't or what the prices are. But there are a lot of exchanges where actually you should care. So if instead what we're talking about is whether or not I attend school, whether I go to college, yes, there's a lot of private decision making here as to whether I'm going to make that decision, whether I'm going to pay for it, whether my parents are going to pay for it. But there's also a larger, quote, positive externality to everyone in society if I get a college education, because presumably there's some evidence on this. I'm a better citizen if I'm more educated. I give more back to society. I make higher wages. I get taxed at a higher rate. Society gets more value out of me if I'm more educated. So we have a real investment in educating people, and we can argue about whether we ought to provide guaranteed college educations, but we don't argue about whether we ought to provide guaranteed grade school and high school educations. Not only do we provide them, we mandate that everybody go through school at least through the age of 16. And that is a form of basically government intervening, providing the schools themselves, in fact, and mandating that people attend them because we think education has such a huge positive externality to society. So there are a number of things that we provide because of that. Closely related to externalities is this issue of public goods, things that we all share, roads, national defense, things that if I use, it doesn't diminish your use of it. So I can drive down the road this morning, you can drive down it this afternoon. It's obviously not a private good, it's a public good. And these things tend to be underprovided because I buy my value worth, and I could care less if you want to drive that road in the afternoon. So there's a real value to government coming in and providing public goods at the appropriate level. there are a variety of there's a huge literature in economics on market failure and when it's appropriate, when it isn't appropriate for government to come in. In these situations, the role of the government is to correct the market problem. In fact, markets function more efficiently because of the direct intervention in the market. There's a clear economic justification for government action. Now, there is a lot of debate in economics over when exactly this is true and when it isn't. When is there an economic justification for government intervention and when is there not? Or to say it another way, when does government intervention screw up the market and when does it actually help the market? So, there are a whole variety of arguments that people make that argue that there's very, very limited number of situations when actually the government can correct the market. All right. So, for instance, there's a lot of arguments about the fact that unnecessary government regulations create all sorts of waste of economic resources. They can lead to the wrong economic choices. If you regulate something where the market was actually doing a pretty good job in, you can end up making everybody worse off, making everyone pay higher prices, making a good less available that people want. So, oftentimes, for instance, in economics, there's an argument that says if you mandate certain types of pollution control equipment, you do much worse than if you let then you essentially say what you do is you regulate the amount of emissions that a factory can put out and let the factory itself decide how best to achieve that level of emissions. So far better to set the goal and let the market decide what the cheapest way of doing this is, rather than to basically having a government mandate that this is the equipment that has to be used. So unnecessary government regulations are often considered wasteful. The provision of public goods. Oftentimes there's a lot of argument over what is a public good and when the market should actually be able to provide something as opposed to when we should let government provide it. For instance, the post office is sometimes considered a public good. It can be argued that there's a reason here to have one large company that at the same price delivers letters to rural Montana as well as downtown Nashville. But there are other people who argue that this is actually a waste of resources and that we'd be much better off if we simply privatize the postal service. There are people who argue that schools should not be considered public goods or positive externalities, that we'd be better off privatizing and allowing choice to a much greater extent in the public school system. So there's a lot of arguments here as to how far government should go, what you privatize and what you don't privatize. Finally, there's clearly waste in tax and transfer systems and in bureaucratic overhead costs. You have to tax people to run government programs, and it's costly to run government programs. It would be better if we could do this directly back and forth in the market without putting government in the middle. So there, again, it's a lot of arguments here for privatization. Now, honest and smart economists argue all the time about where the line should be drawn between useful and wasteful government activity. And indeed, I should say that this is a very unsettled debate inside economics. You have people like Milton Friedman, who won a Nobel Prize in the 1970s for essentially arguing that market failure is extremely rare, and we rarely need government intervention, not never, but rarely. On the other hand, you have Joe Stiglitz, who won a Nobel Prize in economics in, I think, 2000, for essentially arguing exactly the opposite, that market failure is very widespread, and doing a whole series of articles on what one should do in order to resolve market failure and how you need public intervention in these things. So this is not a settled area, right? There's a lot of room for disagreement. Nonetheless, I think all economists would agree that there is some places, parts of where market failure occurs and where the government should come in. The disagreement is on how frequent they are. So one argument for government. All right. Second argument. Let me now switch from being an economist and instead talk out of a political science perspective. All right. And here the argument is that government's role is to let the market operate, but then to come in and rearrange some of the outcomes. All right. So the government's role is redistributional, to rearrange market outcomes in response to citizen needs. As I say, this is often an argument made out of political economy. The main example of this, of course, is the tax and transfer system. We transfer from workers to non-workers through retirement systems, disability systems, unemployment systems. We transfer from richer to poorer people through housing subsidies and food stamps and a variety of tax systems. There are some programs that transfer from poorer to richer people as well. We transfer from childless families to families with children by providing public education. There's a whole variety of child tax credits and deductions that are available. So there's a lot of ways in which government essentially redistributes the pieces. After the market allocates them to different people, the government comes in and through the tax and transfer system redistributes them. So why would you want to do this? Okay. And the argument here is that there are valid social and citizen concerns that the market simply cannot address, but which people demand be addressed through government instead. All right? So here are some of the things that people often will argue for. There's an argument it's called I'll call it the investment argument, that actually these redistributional activities improve economic well-being for everyone, that what we're doing here is we're investing in children, we're investing in everyone having good health, we're investing in people basically being better citizens over time, so job training, Head Starts, Pell Grants for low-income college students, health care to avoid future health care assistance, to avoid future health care costs, are all arguments that say these redistributions are actually investments. We're all going to be better off in the long run when we do this. I might say I think there's some real truth to this argument. It's often stated, and particularly in religious circles, it's stated in quite utopian ways. There's actually saying that we're all better off in the long run because of most of our redistributional programs, and I think that's hard to hold on to. But there certainly are some investment arguments going on here. Second argument, rather than investment, let's talk about pure self-interest. It may well be true that redistribution creates political stability because it does redistribute from the elites in society to the less elite in society. It prevents social unrest. There is actually, sort of the more Marxist theory here says that you're basically initiating some form of social control by giving the poor just enough to keep them quiescent. I don't think you have to go that far. You can give a more middle-range argument here that essentially says redistribution is a level of demand that governments have to face if they want to stay in office. And if you want long-term stability without sort of regular revolutions from below, that you prevent social unrest, you prevent riots, you prevent political discontent. Of course, that doesn't mean you always have to be redistributing to the poor. You could just be redistributing enough to your political enemies to keep them from ousting you. It's a question of who you're redistributing to there is an open question. Thirdly, government redistribution we could consider an insurance plan as opposed to an investment plan. At some point, we all hope to be elderly. Therefore, we should redistribute to the elderly so we don't have to take care of our parents and we don't have to worry about our kids taking care of us. Many of us could well end up being single mothers. And welfare programs for single mothers are a form of insurance for the rest of us so that if we hit this problem, we're taken care of. Unemployment insurance, you can think of, obviously the very name, it's insurance against losing our jobs. So that basically government redistribution provides a floor to market outcomes, and we support it for very self-interested reasons because it protects us against future bad states of the world in which we become disabled, poor, elderly, single mothers, unemployed due to economic and demographic shifts. Finally, a fourth argument for redistribution, which comes much more out of often religious perspectives or human rights perspectives, is simply an argument that says human beings have a certain amount of basic human worth and that we owe it to human beings to give them certain basic goods, food, housing, clothing, that these are inherent, human rights that you need in order to live with dignity, and all human beings deserve these basic fundamental rights. It's sort of an economic rights argument, which sounds relatively radical in the U.S. context, doesn't sound nearly so radical if you're talking to European groups. We tend to believe in political rights and not economic rights in this country, but it's an argument that's often made for government redistribution. Now, there's two ways to think about this sort of redistribution. One is what I sort of led into this with, which is a sort of a separate sphere argument, that the market goes out there and generates incomes to different people, and then government goes along and taxes them and redistributes them, and there's sort of these two separate entities that that each function independently. There's an alternative view of this, which is actually to think of both the market and the government as in partnership with each other. And particularly if you take the insurance view or the political stability view or the investment view, you might argue that the government redistribution is actually quite important to long-term stability of markets and for long-term productivity of your citizens, so that you could view this redistribution as actually the partnership between the market and the government that enhances long-term economic growth. It's an extension of the public goods externality arguments. But people talk about this in different ways. Oh, my sign is falling down behind me, huh? Now, there are people who disagree with distribution in a variety of ways. Those who argue against this will make a number of arguments. One of them is that it's very difficult to decide which forms of redistribution are good and which are bad. So one person's good transfer, of course, is another person's waste, fraud, and abuse in the government. And once transfers become possible, i.e. once you have a tax and transfer system in place, all sorts of special interests can capture it. So, of course, we don't just transfer to children and to the poor and to the disabled. We also make transfers to beekeepers and peanut producers, to those who buy hybrid cars, to those with farm income, to those with capital gains income, to those who own houses. That, it's a slippery slope out there, right? And everybody wants transfers for themselves. So you may want to limit this whole tax and transfer system, not because you don't think there's some good things that could come out of it, but because you think once it's in place, it's just too slippery a slope, and it just becomes completely unwieldy and out of hand. And so far better to do very little of this than to open up the possibilities of all of the different pork barrel projects that can get on the list otherwise. Second argument against transfers is the pure efficiency costs. And economists talk a lot about this. Transfers do usually have some incentives embedded in them that are counterproductive. So as much as I support cash transfers to low-income individuals, it is also true that cash transfers has embed within them disincentives to work. Now, we can argue how big those disincentives are and are they a problem and when should we worry about them, but there are disincentives inside most transfer systems that change behavior, and a lot of people tend to think those disincentives are very large and argue against transfers. There's another group that thinks they're relatively small. Thirdly, another reason to argue against this is simply the argument that there are less costly ways of doing this. Why have government do it if you could do it another way? And for instance, well, if you want old age insurance, why don't you tell people buy old age insurance? Why didn't you have them save? Why should government be the one who does this? Why shouldn't people do this? Why shouldn't kids care for their parents? Why should we load this on government as opposed to leaving it to market transactions or to inter-family decision making? Or the argument that we should do this not just through the market, but we should do it through private transfers. So if Doug, as a good Christian man of faith, wants to help the poor, well, he can give his money to the poor. He can go out and make sure they're homeless shelters. His church can organize this. Why should we leave it? Let the people who care about the poor take care of the poor, and the rest of the people can do what they want to do. So there are a number of people who will argue that this sort of redistribution actually is often out of a more libertarian perspective creates a mandate that simply shouldn't be in place. So there's strong arguments about exactly how far you go with these tax and transfer systems. Third argument for government, and this is sort of government in opposition to the market, that government's role is actually to confront, to limit the size of the market, and to provide rules and protection to keep certain areas of our society from being marketized. All right? And the basic concern here is that markets are incredibly pervasive. Once you let them in, they'll take over everything. Ask an economist. You start thinking about all of your behavior as sort of cost-benefit marketized. You don't just think about, is it good or bad for me to buy this newspaper, or good or bad for me to invest in this pension fund? But I sit there and think about, well, am I better or worse off if I stay married to this guy? And am I better or worse off with continuing, you sort of start thinking in these cost-benefit market frameworks and thinking about what the prices are. And there is an argument out of a variety of perspectives that say you just don't want to do that for certain spheres of society. So government's role is to protect certain spheres of society and set them apart from the market. What are some of those things that we protect? We recognize marriage as a separate sphere that has legal meaning, and that is not necessarily, there are societies that have bride prices, but even in those societies, it's not just a market transaction in most cases, and certainly not in this society. We give marriage legal meaning. You can't just buy your way out of it in most cases. You have to go through a different process. You force parents to support and nurture their children. I can't go up to my 11-year-old and say, okay, kid, you become an adolescent. It's getting really difficult. It's time for you to go. I've had enough of this. The costs are bigger than the gains. I have to continue supporting that child to the age of 18 in one form or another. It's not a market transaction. Okay? We protect human beings from commodification. We disallow child labor. We disallow the sales of human organs. We disallow prostitution in many cases. That there's certain things around the body and around being human that we don't want marketized. We protect religious expression and put religious expression in a separate sphere. And we protect the sphere of civil justice. You can't buy and sell votes on a jury. You can't buy and sell police protection. Not to say this doesn't happen, but it's considered a crime when it does, and it's not supposed to happen. so that we create all sorts of rules, particularly around the civil sphere, that say this is not for sale. Okay, your vote is your vote. It cannot be. It's unalienable from you. I can't sell it to Doug, no matter what he pays me for. And similarly, saying jury by peer is a judgment call that can't be bought or sold. No matter how rich or poor I am, I get the same jury, with the same judicial process. Now, again, we can all talk about the limits to that, but it's a theory that says we're separating that from the market and from buying and selling. Similarly, we override some individual discriminatory preferences. I actually can't sell only to the people I like. I have to, if I'm running a store or a lunch counter, open up to anyone regardless of race, gender, ethnic preference, religion, nationality. We force equal access to jobs, to lunch counters, to public transportation, to voting. But we don't do that in the private sphere. I can marry anyone I want. I can be completely discriminatory there on the basis of race and gender and ethnic, but in the public sphere of the market, I actually have to behave differently. So clearly, this is an area where there's a lot of dispute as to where is it that the government should protect certain aspects of behavior from the market, and where should it allow people to do whatever they want to do. For instance, to name just a couple of really hot-button topics in modern American society. Is an abortion something that should be bought and sold? Does it exist as a marketed right between a woman and her doctor? Or is it something that should be put outside the sphere of the market and made impossible? You cannot buy or sell it. There's questions right at the heart of these sorts of issues of what belongs in the market and what doesn't. Does this fall under the body parts issue, similar to sales of organs, or is it not? Should homosexual unions receive the same government protection as heterosexual unions? What is considered acceptable government limitations here? What is protected and what is not protected? Clearly, these are things that change over time. They vary across societies. They change over time within a society as social mores change. And there's always an ongoing argument and often some very hot social debates over the limits of where you set things outside the market and where you don't. The objections to this often come from people who are more libertarian in one field versus another. There's a lot of argument. Where should I be allowed to pursue my self-interest? And where can the government be more paternalistic in some sense and say, no, you simply can't do that? When should larger social claims override individual preference? And if I want to sell myself into prostitution, should that be allowed and under what circumstances? Or when should society tell me, no, I can't do that, even if I choose to do it? And those are hard choices, and choices that deserve debate. Now, I should note that these three different roles for government, the economic role that sort of says the government is basically correcting market failure, the political science argument that says government is there to redistribute resources in various ways that society demands, and this third argument that essentially says the government should confront the market and prevent certain things from happening inside markets. These are not all either or choices. It's not like you want to believe one and not believe the other. Indeed, government does things for all of these reasons, and in some cases does it for, there are a number of situations you can argue all three perspectives as to why the government should or shouldn't be involved in some of that. In each of these areas, the government can do some things well, and it might do other things badly. So viewing, my general perspective on all of this is that viewing government as in conflict with the market, and this is a view that you often get in the financial press, right? That, the government is out there making problems for the market, is actually just often wrong. I won't say that it's always wrong, but it's often wrong. And that government often complements the market. That by providing goods that are valuable for market operation, that the market itself may not typically provide. A broadly educated workforce, infrastructure to support market operations, protection and support for new innovations, patents, basic research dollars, that, those are things that actually where the government works in partnership with the market. And similarly, by setting some social issues outside the market, and perhaps refocusing the social conflict on those issues into the public civic sphere of debate and out of the economic sphere of debate might well protect the market and make it function more effectively over some issues. So the market may be better off that the debate about abortion is occurring in Congress and not occurring as much, sort of directly in the marketplace among providers and sellers. Now, clearly things spill over, and that's an example that is so intense that it has spilled over. But I think you can argue that actually that in many cases, government's involvement in redistribution, government's involvement in protecting certain spheres can make the market function more effectively. All right. So that's my basic sort of political economy arguments about why do we want government. And I have to say this, nothing that I've said here is dramatic or not been thought about many, many times in the past if you read political science. But there is there's a marked lack of public conversation about the role of government and how do we think about government. You can read much more about markets and what do markets do and what do you want markets. And if anything, there's sort of this knee-jerk anti-government reaction that you get in modern society. So I find myself when I go into groups wanting to explain, it's the dean of the public policy school in me, right? Wanting to explain why we have government and what it does. And I think it's important to think about what the different roles of government are and what they provide and why you might want the government to do these things and what the limits are, why you might argue against them. All right, so that said, let me then turn to the religious half of the talk, okay? So as I say, I'm going to talk out of a Christian perspective, but I will welcome a conversation that opens this up a little bit more broadly. So the question is, should people's theological commitments, should their religious commitments influence the interpretation of government role? And I guess I think unambiguously, if one takes religion seriously as a driving force in one's personal life, it obviously should affect one's behavior, and it should affect one's behavior not just on Sunday morning, but in the marketplace on Monday morning and in the voting booth on Tuesday morning. And in that sense, people of faith and their activities, they bring that faith with them into the market as they bring that faith with them into the civic and government sphere as well. So the question is then, how do you think about how religion comes together with the market and with the government? There are a few very specific, I went too far, didn't I? Let me say, there are a few strong policy arguments that go directly from theology to specific government policy recommendations. Right? I mean, I think it's just very, very hard to say, well, if you read the Bible, it tells you that we, ought to go run a child tax credit that looks like this, right? I mean, you will occasionally hear those arguments. I think they're pretty specious, okay? But there are sort of meta statements about policy goals that are, meta statements about that religion discusses about the public sphere that I think can give guidance to policy. So, for instance, there is a concern for human dignity and human value in virtually every religion. That almost surely translates into a concern about poverty and a concern about having access to food, to shelter, to human survival. Human beings are not commodities, that they have a spark of dignity within them that we need to protect. Now, whether we protect that with a food stamp program or a subsidy on bread or a free commodity distribution program, that we can debate about endlessly, right? But the meta argument that human beings have inherent worth coming out of religion, I think gives a common perspective to people of faith, which then can lead into a debate about the means by which you accomplish that. Similarly, there's a lot of growing discussion in virtually, certainly the religions in the United States, about the concern for creation and how a commitment to creation relates to a concern for the environment. Now, whether that concern for the environment is done by implementing the Kyoto Accords or whether doing tax breaks for hybrid cars is not something that you can get to very clearly through a religious argument. But the statement that the created order matters and that we live in the midst of a good earth and must worry about maintaining that good earth for ourselves, for our children, for the entire created order that coexists with us, is a statement that sets a meta goal about which we then can argue about means. So let me quickly give an example of how I would think about this out of the Christian faith, and this is obviously specific to some of the Christian learning. So there's a lot of different ways to interpret Christianity, and there's a lot of different Christian flavors out there. But there are a variety of reasonably common things that come out of even quite diverse Christian groups. And I would argue there's some statements here that most Christians, in many situations, I won't be absolutist about this, would tend to agree with, okay? So there's a statement here that says, the Christian faith says that you should be concerned about others, that self-interest alone is not an adequate personal motivation, all right? Secondly, the New Testament, I think, clearly states that the others about which one should be concerned are more than just the people who sit next to you, the people who speak your language, the people who live next door to you, that indeed there's a larger community out there that involves both Christians and non-Christians, out of which one should be concerned. And it's very hard to read the New Testament and not have this broad sense of who the other is and what one's concern should be. Third, values matter. Not all personal wants should be satisfied, and not all individual behaviors should be approved. That there are some desires and some actions that are preferred over other. And the whole area of sort of Christian ethics is about trying to talk about which actions are preferred and which are not, and why. And it's not that that's a fully settled area, but clearly religious people are largely not libertarians, that they believe that some choices are more valuable than other choices. They believe in value-based choice-making, I guess is a way to say it. Fourth point, we should be concerned about more than material goods. We must care about spiritual abundance and not be sidetracked by material abundance as the measure of human worth. That's not to say that one should dismiss material goods. Indeed, if you take the issue of other concerns seriously, you have to be concerned about the distribution of goods and that others can live as well. But material goods can be well used or ill used. And the judgment on someone as a Christian is not on did they have a lot of things, but how did they use the things that they had to reflect their faith values. Okay? And lastly, Doug would not have made this last, Doug would have made this first, but I think it follows out of these. We are especially concerned about the poor, those who are excluded and marginalized. And I might note that that is not just a New Testament message, that's very strongly an Old Testament message as well. Being concerned about those who, the widows and the orphans, those who are outside the patriarchal tribal society in the Old Testament is deeply important. And you translate that into modern language of who are the widows and orphans in a modern capitalist society, the immigrants, the single mothers, the elderly, the disabled, and that we need to be concerned about them. Religious belief and the values that it gives rise to, these values, if you're a Christian, should have some effect on how you view these arguments about the role of government. So I would argue that one can make an argument from those sort of meta statements of concern about other focus and concern about the poor and others, that first of all we should be concerned about the potential injustices that market failures can create. That if the concern for the human condition has material aspects to it, i.e. we care that people are fed, we care about human survival, that we can't care just about the spiritual condition of humanity, but its material condition as well, and then market failures start mattering, because it means we're wasting resources in some way, that we're not using the material goods that we have available to provide life to everyone. You can certainly value the redistributive ability of government. You can believe in the necessity of supporting certain value choices for a broader society. So government's role in protecting certain spheres or in limiting the market, I think, but at least in some areas can fall very directly out of the earlier list of 5 things that I just had on the board. In short, I think that religious belief can provide arguments that are sympathetic to all of these roles of government. Now, I don't want to at all argue that you have to be a religious person in order to believe these different roles for government. That's simply not true at all. That there are many, many reasons why you may value redistribution in government, why you may want to correct market failure, why you may want to protect certain spheres. But you can come to these arguments out of religion as well as out of other arguments. I would argue, however, that there's at least one stronger statement you can make that is perhaps more unique to religious faith, and that pushes us beyond a set of arguments that things you can come to from other arguments as well. And that stronger statement is essentially that the redistributive function of government can be viewed as one avenue through which we as people of faith can meet our obligations to our neighbors. And let me talk a little bit about what I mean by that. Okay? So we live in a market economy. But as people of faith, we're clearly called upon to be aware of the promises as well as the limitations of markets. So my own Christian faith indicates that I should be concerned for my neighbor as well as myself. And Jesus makes it very clear our neighbors are more than just those who live next door, who look like us, who talk like us. Our neighbors include those of different cultures, languages, and races. So the Samaritan, the Iraqi, the immigrant is our neighbor as surely as are our own friends and family. This message has particular resonance in a global economy and particular resonance for Americans in a global economy. Increasingly, our economic lives are connected with the lives of rural agricultural workers throughout the globe, urban factory employees throughout the globe, computer programmers around the world. Our economic actions, what we buy, what we sell, as Americans, particularly in this very, very global marketplace that we live in, affect people not just in our own local community, not just in our national community, but they ripple across the world. This is, of course, true particularly for Americans whose buying power has so much impact on the global economy. In this world, the faith-based responsibility to our global neighbors must be taken, I think, with greater seriousness than the world of 50 to 100 years ago, where my buying and selling actions had virtually no impact whatsoever on anyone outside of regional and local economy. Those neighbors who live far away have become more closely connected to our lives, and our market decisions affect them. So the government provides a way to fund assistance and provide services to the poor and the disadvantaged, both in this nation, through food stamps, through housing subsidies, through Head Start programs, and around the world through emergency aid, through development aid, etc. Those who see government as a complement to church-based outreach programs, would view this essentially say, on the one hand, if the Christian faith tells you to reach out to other individuals, there's no question that means you probably ought to be reaching out in your local community, individually as well as through your church community. But clearly that is not adequate. If your actions are affecting people throughout the globe, you've got to think about ways to have impact on those people as well and to treat those people as neighbors. Some of that may be simply through paying attention to the market choices that I make. The whole movement towards fair trade coffee or, for, all sorts of non-sweatshop labor and, buying things that are certified. And clearly that's one way to do this, and those are individual actions that are important. There are ways in which church communities do this through international mission efforts, international relief efforts, international education efforts. But the things that we do individually, and given the size of many of our churches, the things our churches do are often a drop in the bucket relative to our impact through our economic and market-based choices. The government gives us a way, as individual people of faith, of thinking about how can we extend our other directedness, our concern for the disadvantaged and the poor, not just through our own actions and through our church actions, but through our government actions as well. And to think about the development aid that this country provides, or the food stamp programs that it runs, as not only justified through a whole variety of arguments around government and transfers and all of that, but also justified through a variety of faith-based arguments about seeing these programs as a way in which we reach out to the other and as important commitments of us as people of faith in how we touch the lives of others. In short, my support for particular government actions are very much based in my faith commitments, and I don't apologize for that nor necessarily shrink away from it. In that way, I think I do have at least somewhat a different perspective on government as a person of faith, in that I see government programs not just as a political scientist or as an economist, but also as a religious individual who sees the civic actions of my government as reflecting the commitments that I make, and therefore who I elect, what I argue for, how I lobby my government, is both a religious activity as well as an economic and political science activity in some ways. Let me say, let me be clear that this does not lead necessarily to all pro-government tendencies, all right? I'm not saying everything the government does is good. Christians should be very concerned with the waste of material resources that bad government action takes place. We should value the efficiency of the market because basically more efficient markets are more abundant markets. It makes more resources available to all of us that can be used in a variety of ways. Christians value direct human contact and service, I would like to believe, and government can never substitute for those individual acts of kindness and outreach. And I would not want to argue that, well, as long as I pay my taxes and make sure that we provide emergency aid to the next humanitarian disaster in eastern China, I'm therefore fulfilling my religious obligations, that there are many other things that one's religious obligations require of one, including some very direct service and contact. We were talking about this as lunch of what does it mean to live in solidarity with the poor, to use some terms from Christian theology, and how do you make contact and live in the midst of the poor in a world where, at least in America, the distance between middle and upper class people and lower income people is becoming greater and greater as wage inequality rises, as income segregation in housing rises. It becomes more and more difficult to be in touch with, to be in conversation with, to touch the lives of, or to listen and hear from the people who are at other ends in the economic spectrum. And I think there's a real call to do that as a person of faith That's, but that is not enough by itself, nor is government thinking about what the government does enough by itself. So let me make a couple of cautionary statements here in addition to this. That's not actually where I want to be. Let me go back. So I've tended to focus on what government can do and can do well. In our society, the arguments are always pro-market and anti-government, right? So I've been here arguing the pro-government line only because it doesn't get expressed enough. If I were in a different situation, and I found myself in these situations sometimes in Europe, where the assumption is the government can solve all these problems, I find myself instead arguing the market line and what the market can do and why you need the balance of the two of them. There is government failure. There are areas where government is more effective. There are areas where public decision-making often fails in a wide variety of ways. And thinking about how government is done right, how it is most effective, how it provides services as efficiently as possible is absolutely as important as thinking about how the marketplace is done right. And schools of public policy, in part, are about talking about public management and effective government, and it's one reason why I find them interesting places to be. Faithful people should always resist the secular temptation to deify the market, but they should also resist the temptation to deify the public sector as a more moral sector of society. I do not believe the market is moral, but neither do I believe that the public sector is inherently moral either. Like the human beings that create them and make them up, both public and private institutions have the potential for good and the potential for evil. Which of these are accomplished depends a great deal upon the choices we make as we establish, shape, and participate in these institutions. That said, the government provides an imperfect but important institution that regulates and limits the market, hopefully to create a better balance between the market and society. We live in this world, surrounded by our humanly created market systems and political structures. But we know that these structures are limited by the human beings that design them and that work within them. When the market helps to create human potential, we should rejoice and celebrate that. But when the market encourages greed and creates pain, we should act as a faithful critic of the economic world in which we live. Sometimes faithful criticism is best expressed through civic participation, through the political leaders we select, through the policies that we support. The values that religious people hold and the characteristics of the religious spirit, discernment, mercy, and kindness, are not just relevant to our private lives among family and friends. They're also an important touchstone in our public lives, which we should refer to and call upon as we make choices, both as market participants and citizens. There is an important role for government. I believe that not just as an economist who thinks markets fail, not just as a political scientist who thinks there's a need for redistribution, but also as a religious person who values human dignity, who values God's creation, and who takes my responsibility to my neighbors seriously. We are fortunate to live in a democratic system where our public institutions can help us express these values. If our government is failing us, it is because we are failing as citizens to shape a government that expresses those values. And I will stop there. Absolutely. Questions, comments, arguments, disagreements? Yeah.
I have so many, but I'm going to try to limit myself. At the beginning of your presentation, you talked about the equality of information in markets and how that's a fundamental aspect of the equality and the proper functioning of markets.
Mm-hmm.
It seems to me that the vast majority of valuation in our markets is based on inequality of information and inequality of knowing, which gives the buyer an advantage over.
Okay.
Which gives the buyer a strategic advantage, which is popular. I mean, I don't see that markets are fundamentally equal in terms of the ways of knowing. And part of what makes me think about that is how we value labor and the different kinds of ways in which we value labor in our society. I look at how people get paid in this country, and a lot of what people get paid for are things that are bad. They're things that are bad for the environment. They're things that are bad for their own quality of life, and really are kind of destructive forces.
Yeah.
But there's this evaluation process that happens that creates a fundamental kind of inequality between the buyer and the seller, between the capitalist, the factory
So,
I was just
yeah.
wondering if you could address this idea of
Yeah.
this fundamental principle of equality in markets is something that makes markets function well.
So I've been asked to repeat the question, and it's an extended question, but there's a question here about, aren't markets predicated on basically one side trying to get more information than another side? As sort of part one of the question. And part two of the question is, isn't it true that a lot of people get paid to do things that are actually destructive of society in some ways, and that markets encourage that? If that's a fair summary, it's a brief summary, okay? So let me talk about information. There are some markets where information asymmetries are much easier than in other areas, but there are a lot of markets where that's not true. For instance, markets are ever creative. So if indeed I find myself thinking that I don't have enough information about the goods that I'm buying, whether it's a new refrigerator or a new washing machine, guess what? There happens to be another market which is called consumer information, and I can go buy consumer affairs, or what's it called, consumer reports, where they test all these products and give me very detailed information about how they perform and how long they last and what their price comparisons are. So, these markets have a lot of ways to provide information, and even if Doug as a seller is trying to hide what he actually did to that can of corn before before I buy it, there are a variety of ways I can find that out. Not always, but in many cases, the other answer is that in many markets you actually are engaged in what's called a repeated gain. I buy corn more than once in my lifetime. If I don't like what he sells me, I'll go to the person next door and buy that. If I don't like that, so that there's oftentimes things that are frequently bought. There's a lot of information about them. The asymmetries in information occur a lot more often in things that are very infrequently bought. I buy a car once every 5 years. It's a lot easier to have asymmetry of information in the car market between buyers and sellers than there is in the grocery market on something that's bought virtually every. I know a lot about the milk on the grocery store shelf and what I buy and when I buy it, and there are asymmetries. It's exactly in those asymmetries when the role of government comes in, and indeed. In the car market, there is government regulation of information. In the stock market, there is government regulation of information. There are rules about labeling on appliances that have to be accurate, right, and have to be provable in some sense as accurate. So that it really becomes a partnership. And again, I'm going back to the partnership theme, oftentimes between the government and the market in providing that information. Now, is it true that any one seller has a incentive to hide information? Yes, probably so. But if there's any competition going on in the market, that seller will not stay in business terribly long. That's the pure theory, right? And sometimes it works fast, and sometimes it works slow. Sometimes it doesn't work at all, and that's exactly when the government comes in. So I think I disagree with you that there's inherent asymmetries in information. It's more true in some cases than in others. Let me just say one thing about the issue of being paid for socially negative goods, okay? Comment number one is, your socially negative good might be exactly what I want, right? So, you have to get into the business of judging what's good and what's bad in some larger sense than based on individual preferences, all right? So, I just love driving SUVs, and you think that that's a really bad choice. Who's going to, there's some companies that are going to sell me SUVs, and some companies are going to sell you hybrids, right? If you want to intervene in that, you have to go through a social process whereby, in a discussion in the civic realm, you persuade enough people that that elected officials tell GM they can no longer produce SUVs. And that's exactly the role of government. If enough people think that a good is so socially bad it shouldn't be provided, then the government will come in and do some regulation on it, and there'll be that type of reaction. But in most cases, there are a lot of different preferences. And I'm enough of an economist to believe that I'm very wary of imposing my preferences on someone else in large ranges of the buying and selling of a lot of goods. There are a lot of things I don't buy. And I don't buy them because I don't like them. I don't buy them because I object to them in an ethical and value-based sense. But I don't want to necessarily impose that preference on a lot of other people. I have to feel that pretty strongly before I go lobbying my congressman to say you should actually abolish the sales of this thing altogether. So, I mean, the government does provide an outlet to do that, but preferences vary a lot, and I'm hesitant about making too strong a statement about what's good preferences and bad preferences. Yeah, in the back. Yeah.
I really like your talk, and I certainly don't challenge for a second the role of government in the way you described it. In fact, my way of thinking is a desirable function for government to play in an otherwise unbridled situation. But the model that you present of government doesn't have a theory to redistributive types of interventions by government. Obviously, there are very strong mobilizations of large numbers of people organized, as we discussed earlier, that bring about these kinds of transformations of government. So my question is, building on what you have here, is it possible to fashion a Christian argument about why individuals should develop a movement to promote certain forms of government intervention, assuming that it just doesn't happen out of thin air or that some economists end up convincing some other economists that we need some intervention?
Yeah. So the question is, how do you generate a movement that changes government in some form or another, and is there explicitly a way to develop a Christian theory of a Christian rhetoric around creating public movements of this sort? Well, we were at lunch, I mean, a few people in the room were at this lunch, discussing various religious-based movements that had had tremendous impact on the public sector. And, obviously the growth in the presence of sort of the right-wing, more evangelical groups organizing around a set of political issues, and particularly around abortion and around certain marriage issues, has had an enormous impact in the public sector. And similarly, in quite a different way, I should say, there's the other major religious movement that I think has had huge impacts on policy has been the American Jewish movement and support for Israel in the United States. It's had an enormous impact on our Israeli policy, and not that we wouldn't have viewed Israel as special, but we view it as very special as a result of very, very strong lobbying and consistent support for that. So the question is sort of what is it that drove those particular religious movements, and is there something I don't think there's anything unique about a religious movement as opposed to any other movement. You can talk about the environmental movement or the feminist movement that in some sense those also accomplished a variety of things and went so far and didn't accomplish other things, and there are theories about these movements. Yeah.
To get involved
Yeah.
in the environmental movement.
Yeah. Yeah.
Just it stemmed from creation and Genesis, and why not the Exodus?
So, depending on which topic we're talking about, I think you can build different justifications. I mean, the environmental movement can come out of a variety of different, particularly Old Testament strands. And you can certainly have Christian justification for getting involved in this. On the other hand, there are many other reasons to be involved in and I'm not sure that religion gives a particular level of interest and motivation to certain groups of people to act on particular issues, all right? Whether that's the environment or whether that's the abortion or whether that's, money for Israel. That can be an effective organizing tool because it's often a group of people who have a common language and a common value set. So it's probably more easy to create a political movement among an already organized group, which a religious group is. You know how to get in touch with them, you know the language to speak with them, and you know how to motivate them. And in that sense, religion has often played an important part in policy because it's a pre-organized group. You can say the same thing about the labor movement, right? And you can say the same thing about some other groups that have played a role in this. I'm not sure there's anything unique about Christian social movements as opposed to other social movements, if that's your question. Yeah. Yeah.
Two questions, if I may. They may be related. I'm not sure. It's for you to decide. I think they are. The first is the problem of inequality. And you referred, I think, in your prepared remarks to the growing spread of unequal standing in the economy of our society. Is that an economic problem, or is it some other kind of problem, growing inequality? The second question is, does economic theory have a view on the optimum size of actors within the economy, or on the nature of actors?
So there's two questions. One is growing inequality an economic problem or another type of problem? And the second is there a view about the optimal size of economic actors? I'm going to sort of punt on the last one and say, look, there's a whole bunch of theories about this, and I'm not sure I want to get into that conversation. So I'm just going to sort of ignore that happen. Let me address the first question, okay? We can talk about the other one afterwards. There's not a simple answer to that, and I think the short answer is there's certainly no consensus view about size of actors, at least out of economics. I think there are other perspectives that will often argue that, anthropology, if nothing else, that certain sizes of communities are optimal if you really want to have certain types of conversation and decision making, right? But to talk about what the inequality issue. So it's not like there is a boundary point. And when you go above it, you're in trouble, and when you go below it, you're not in trouble with regard to inequality. Different societies have functioned quite effectively at very different levels of inequality. The U.S. has a much higher level of inequality than many European countries, and we have quite a vibrant and dynamic economy, and so do a number of European economies. So it's clear that there are a variety of different institutional, that essentially the institutions adapt to this. So if you look at inequality, it's not just that wages are more unequal in the United States. It's that the whole set of institutions in the United States are differently organized, which results in greater wage inequality than they are in Sweden. Right, so you've got, it's the whole structure and organization of all of the institutions that interact with the economy, and so it's hard, and there are therefore multiple institutional models, and you can operate with more or less inequality. At what point does this become an economic problem? And that's an interesting question, and of course there's disagreement on this. There's some number of economists and others who would say, inequality, so what? It creates incentives, why not? It becomes an economic problem, I think, first of all, if the floor is falling, and you therefore have groups that are becoming increasingly dispossessed. We've been in a world where it's not just that the top is going up, but the bottom is going down. So you create a lot of problems of access to goods and services and poverty that you've got to worry about. All right, and that becomes an economic problem. You also potentially, the economic problems potentially spill into political problems for all of the arguments I suggested around political stability. I think there's also an issue here, which is, I actually think the biggest problem in terms of the growing inequality in decision-making is around having a common conversation about what are the economic problems in this country and how do we address them. So, if you look at the presidential debates, not just this year, but 4 years ago and 8 years ago and 12 years ago, you've got some group in this economy for whom if you say to them, these are the best years ever. You've never had it so good. Your incomes are high. It's true for most college-educated, certainly people with graduate degrees. Life has never been better. What a great last couple of decades it's been. We need to keep doing just what we're doing, right? They agree with you, and they're right, all right? And there's another group of whom, too, if you say, things are rough. And in fact, in some cases, they're getting worse, and you're working harder, and you're making the same amount of money, and and for that group, so you can't stay in the room with a common economic conversation about what economic reality is. And this both makes it very, very hard to reach consensus around economic policy. There's a whole group of people out there who really don't care very much if Social Security goes bankrupt because they're going to be just fine, and there's another 40% of the population for whom that's the main thing they're going to have when they, so you get these problems of discussing public issues in a common civic conversation because people don't have a common set of touchstones out of their own experience. And that's a policy problem, and those policy problems become economic problems over time because then you can't reform Social Security. You can't come to agreement on what we need to do with regard to health care, and. I view rising inequality beyond a certain point as both an economic problem and as a political problem. The two interact in some very, very important ways. Yeah, here. Yeah.
You spoke early towards the conclusion about how Christians or persons of faith might value the efficiency the market creates because of the potential for greater abundance that we provide. So how might a person of faith balance or reconcile that value of efficiency with the conditions that often come along with that efficiency? You mentioned sweatshop labor, for example, and might that require sort of rethinking what efficiency means?
Well, I think there's a balance here. Efficiency doesn't mean you produce everything as cheaply as you possibly can, regardless of any of the costs on human beings or on anything else, right? And indeed. The products that are produced that way often are not very high quality products and can get driven out of the market in some cases, not always. This is where the balance of what are some of the goals that you want to accomplish. You want to do all of the following, right? You would like to pay a wage that makes work pay, that lets people support their families on that wage. You would like to produce things in a way that is not too destructive of the environment, right, and doesn't use up too many resources beyond what you have to do, and you want to produce something at a price that's reasonable to consumers. Now, those are in conflict with each other at some level, right? And the whole fun of being an economist, in some sense, is thinking about how you balance those sorts of things together in a production process, right? And there's some cases when they get well balanced, and some cases when they don't. And things like concerns on the environment or concerns on minimum wages often involve require the involvement of a government as well as a private sector, and then it becomes a really interesting debate as to well, what's the balance between those two? How high do you set your minimum wage, and at what level, and what's too high? What starts almost any policy has both winners and losers in it. So this balance between the winners and losers is it's the art of good policy design. You're never going to make everyone better off, but hopefully you can find some policies that on net make more people better off than make others worse off. And there's not a single answer to this one. You've got multiple goals all the time, and the problem's messy is the short answer. But that's okay. That's the paradox of modern society. Economies are messy and production processes are messy, and there's just a lot of things you're trying to do at once. Yeah.
Well, thank you very much. This is very helpful and constructive. And as somebody who works in a non-theological realm in my day job, I found your reference to the poor quick. And I wondered if it was intentional or if it was masking a richer theological puzzle. And so my question to you, the short question is, so you're doing very well wrestling with the government market dimensions of the questions that are being asked. But I wonder if you couldn't pose some of the offering that religion has to these puzzles as instead puzzles. So, for example, when you said poor, what happens to analysis if the thing that bothers Christians is poverty? Because then it's not okay to have a redistributive solution. It has to be a solution in which the market and government coordinate such that poverty doesn't get created at all, or such that inequality doesn't take the form of a falling floor and a rising ceiling, but instead takes a form of a shrinking, maybe not a shrinking ceiling. No, sorry, economists. No, but the floor coming up. Anyway, so
don't say that at the business school. Yeah.
Theological puzzle.
Yeah.
What guides us to understand the problem of the poor as one of poverty? And I wonder what other theological puzzles you see coming out of your project.
So the question is sort of to think more about the poor and how the poor interact with this. This is a very crude summary of it, of how the poor interact with this set of issues and what are the puzzles that poverty poses, particularly for markets. Okay. So the flip answer is, my understanding is tomorrow night Doug Hicks and I are going to talk about poverty. So I figured tomorrow night's the poverty conversation. But a short answer to this is the following. I mean, markets don't care about poverty. And say, right, markets don't care what the floor is. If you are a 5-year-old child and an orphan, guess what? You aren't going to be able to support yourself in the labor market, and you're just outside the market, right? If you are a disabled elderly adult, you're just outside the market. So, markets are all about people who are in the market, who can produce resources and then use those resources, right? So, in a sense, they're just, it's not present, right? Which is one of the reasons why you absolutely have to start thinking about the role of government if you care about the poor, right? Because there are large numbers of people, at a minimum, even if you think anyone who can work, we're not going to care about them, they ought to be in the market, they ought to be working. There are in every society, the widows and orphans, so you use that term symbolically, but who literally often cannot engage in market work, cannot command resources, and therefore, will starve to death unless someone cares for them. Now, there's one answer, which is they are cared for within a family structure or a tribal structure, right? That was an older answer. That becomes less attractive in a modern society where tribes don't exist and families are increasingly splintered. And therefore, the role of other institutions to step in be they nonprofit institutions or government-based institutions, become very strong. And I think one of the strongest reasons that, the strongest argument for government, in my opinion, but this is me who says caring about the poor is a very, very high concern, is that markets don't care about floors and don't care about people outside the market. And therefore, you must have government to come in, take care of those who are outside the market, assure that they have resources, and for those for whom the market is not enough, do some assistance to bring them up to at least a subsistence level if you possibly can afford it. Okay, so where you go from there, I know there are people who want to argue that we actually ought to set up a market process by which we guarantee that employers pay a certain level of wages. The trouble is that's not very different from mandated minimum wage from the government. And rather than sort of telling yourself, oh, we're just going to make employers do it, you ought to think about this as a government process, because you are imposing a certain stricture on the market, and thinking about it as the ways in which government and markets interact is a much clearer theoretical construct than just saying we're going to leave it to the private sector and have them do it. I don't know if that's a clear answer, but it's at least a starting answer. Yeah, behind.
I just wondered,
Yeah.
Europe came up in a couple times in your remarks. I'm wondering if Europeans are puzzled by our grappling with this issue, because poverty is higher here,
Yeah.
inequality is higher,
So
you
the-
get
yeah.
church going, and all those sort of traditional religious
Yeah.
indices are
Yeah.
higher here
Yeah.
than in Europe.
So the question is about Europe, and how does Europe think about the United States? So the conversation in Europe around anti-poverty policies in particular has changed dramatically in my lifetime. When I was a young junior faculty member who would go to Europe and say, oh, I work on poverty, people would laugh. Someone from the U.S. who works on poverty, that's funny. Americans don't care about poverty. Things have changed in Europe, and they've changed for a couple of reasons. One is that Europe's been through a very long period of stubbornly high unemployment and slow growth. The European Union has created certain economic challenges that come, and Europe has experienced an enormous amount of immigration. And guess what? You don't have homogeneity in a lot of those Scandinavian countries that you used to have in terms of population and background and common language and common history. And the result of all of that is that the conversation in Europe is looking increasingly around welfare and policy issues, looking increasingly like the conversation in the United States. So that, much to my amazement, I am actually in demand with a variety. I am meeting with the finance minister of Sweden on Friday to have lunch with him to discuss the earned income tax credit and how this can be better implemented in Sweden, how they can use this policy. And I mean, it amazes me the extent to which Europe is now looking to the United States as a way to think about models for social welfare policy. So conversations change and the world changes, and that doesn't mean that there's still not a lot of sort of puzzlement as to why is the U.S. so stingy on some of these things. Now, one thing I will say, the U.S. is much less stingy on the following measure. We actually give to private foundations and give an enormous amount through individual giving and through nonprofits, particularly through churches, and that just doesn't happen in Europe. And there's an argument that says a much more heterogeneous society, like the U.S. has long been, is much more likely to support, to cede a little bit more to private interests, right? So that, I with my group of, Presbyterians can support who I want to group, and Doug with his group of Methodists can support who he wants to support, and there's much more sort of a private market in what we all do as opposed to a single set of government programs. And we have a much greater and richer private market in the caring for individuals through the nonprofit sector almost doesn't exist in most countries in Europe. And we have a very, very rich and involved private sector here in the U.S. So the church going has translated into something in the United States. It's just as with the inequality issue, it's a very different set of institutions and a very different approach than Europe has ever taken. Yeah.
I think you ought to work on a scale where you can throw all of these various things you've discussed with us so well this afternoon, and to see to what extent they are working properly, cooperating with one another, challenging one another, offsetting one another. And if there were such a scale, where would we be today? 5, 6,
on a scale of how many? 100 or 50? No. So the question is, could you measure how we're doing on a variety of these things? And we actually were having a conversation at lunch. I'm not going to give you the answers to where I think we are. I mean, I think it really varies by issue. I think we've made real progress on some issues. The problem is, of course, you solve one issue, and the world is incredibly dynamic. So, we actually did quite a bit to reduce pollution and effluviance in the air and in the water in the 1970s. And, gosh darn it, life isn't fair. 40 years later, we're facing a whole other environmental environmental crisis, right? So if the world were static, it would be a lot easier to measure your progress than it is. That said, there's an incredibly important role here for effective measurement. And again, the government here almost has to play an important role in creating consistent and non-political agencies that do these sorts of measures and enforce them upon both private sector and public sector companies or organizations to try to measure how are we doing in terms of pollution, how are we doing in terms of serving the poor and reducing economic need, how are we doing with regard to unemployment. Now, unemployment is one where we actually have a statistic that's pretty widely held. Health insurance is one where our statistics aren't very good, right? So, yeah. On which issue? I actually, it really does depend what issue we're talking about. I mean, we're doing very poorly, not surprisingly, on a set of quite crucial issues that involve very long-term decision-making, like Social Security and Medicare coverage for the people who are not yet retired, and the environmental issues fit it. We're very bad. I mean, democratic societies, are very, very bad at mandating sacrifices now for long-term issues. Dictators are much better if you want to deal with long-term, issues of this sort. Enlightened dictators, I guess I should say, are better. But yeah, all right, I'll take 4. Yeah, there's a question over here. Yeah.
I have a question about the conflict that I see between the competition that drives a market and the basically cooperative, I think, message of a religious tradition. And I don't see how they can cooperate.
Yeah. So the question is about competition versus cooperation, and doesn't this make markets inherently at odds with religion? I would expand that question and say the other way in which certainly economic theory is in direct conflict with certainly the Christian religion is the emphasis on self-interest versus being concerned about more than self. And economic theory with its emphasis on self-interest and competition and individualistic behavior is it is a very particular model of the world. It is a very good predictive model of the world in certain circumstances. And as a very simple first case forecasting tool, it actually works awfully well in a lot of economic circumstances. But there are places where it breaks down. And it precisely breaks down in situations where people are exhibiting some form of altruism and other interest, where people are acting more cooperatively rather than altruistically. It also breaks down in situations where people are exercising strong power out of sort of the power stories as opposed to the simple competition stories.
I think that it may be a matter of the historical moment at which you introduce a cooperative model of economic organization or something. Because up till a certain point, of course, it's going to be a competitive model. But past that point, it seems to me like the paradigm has to change, or else we just destroy it.
So I may be so embedded in my economics training that I can't see this issue clearly. But I have to say that I don't think there's much historical argument to argue that in large heterogeneous modern economies, appealing solely to cooperative interest is going to get you very far. I think you want to set up incentives for people to behave in the right way.
You don't want to limit
right.
competition.
No,
The
yeah.
question is which takes
Yeah.
priority
Yeah.
in the economic organization.
And you can set up organizations in such a way that they encourage cooperation. You guys who teach in business school, if there are any of you here who have been in business schools, you know that you can set up a class so that you encourage people to work cooperatively in groups, and you can grade in such a way that encourages that. Or you can set up a class in such a way that encourages very individualistic, competitive, one-against-one behavior. And you can do the same thing inside private sector organizations. You can set up more cooperative and less cooperative models. You can do some of the same things inside of in governmental organizations as well. And I mean, it's actually an argument I make at some length in this book, Is the Market Moral, is that we should be about setting up institutions in ways that incentivize certain behaviors that we shouldn't be neutral about behavior. There's some behaviors we should be incentivizing more than others. Yeah.
First, one comment about the cooperation competition. There's some literature out there that talks about co-opetition, where you look for an equilibrium or a steady state, something that's sustainable, where you're competing and you're cooperating, and there's some form of a natural equilibrium where either party has an incentive to change their strategy.
Yeah, no, it's very interesting theory.
There is literature out there that talks about balance. But my question is, because you have kind of the political science and economic hats that you wear during these, I want to know which one wins out on the issue of minimum wage, because minimum
that's
wage
easy.
is a pretty straightforward economic argument, and
I actually think you're absolutely wrong, okay? I think that there's a small group of there's a group of economists who don't understand minimum wage, all right? And they argue the following, that when you set a minimum wage, you are automatically creating some disemployment, and therefore it's bad. And we don't deal with any policy analysis that simplistically in almost any other area. The following is true when you set a minimum wage. If you're setting a minimum wage above the prevailing wage, you're going to keep some people employed at a higher wage. You're going to disemploy others. What happens to them is uncertain, and you better pay attention to what happens to them. And do they find informal work? Do they go? Are these all retirees? So and the issue of who stays employed at higher wages and who becomes disemployed is a cost-benefit analysis. And there are some circumstances, and if the disemployment is quite small and the number of people who stay employed is quite large, minimum wages are a good idea. Right? So, even from a purely economic perspective, the cost-benefit analysis requires a lot more than simply saying minimum wages create disemployment, therefore problem solved, they're a bad idea. You've got to actually analyze who's winning and who's losing and what the costs and gains are. So, even from an economic perspective, there are many cases when you can argue for minimum wages. From a broader perspective, I think there are other arguments for minimum wages outside economics. The most important one to me is the purely symbolic one, that I want people to believe that working in the mainstream labor market is very important. And I'm actually willing to impose some costs in order to symbolically send that message, so that if you work full-time, you ought to earn enough to support yourself and at least one other person in your family. And that symbolic argument about why you want minimum wages is deeply important to society. And I take that as seriously as I take the economic cost-benefit analysis. Third reason for a minimum wage, also an economic argument. Minimum wages force employers to provide a workplace in which everyone earns, produces, say it's $5 an hour, produces $5 an hour. It drives out sweatshop labor if it's enforced. What does sweatshop labor do? They basically take a whole bunch of people, give them a crummy room, give them crummy machines, say we're going to pay you piecework. If you only produce 50 cents an hour, you get paid 50 cents an hour. With a minimum wage, you can't run a business that way. You've actually got to provide an environment where people are productive enough to earn the minimum wage. And there's a real argument here for enforced minimum wages in a variety of settings of driving out the most abusive labor practices, actually. So, yeah.
Well, we all agree that you can't set the minimum wage at $30 an hour.
Yeah. Yeah.
So there are economic principles.
Yes.
Theories
Yes.
that say there's a limit to what we want to do.
Yes. Yes.
Those theories, if they hold at $20 an hour, they still hold at $7.
But your costs and benefits are different, because presumably the disemployment is much greater at $20 an hour, and the gainers are many fewer. At $7 an hour, the unemployment is much smaller, and the number of people who stay employed and gain is much larger. So you have a very different cost-benefit calculation at those two different points. I am a strong supporter of minimum wages, but up to a limit. And I've argued against $10 an hour minimum wages, and I've argued for $7 minimum wages for exactly the sort of analysis that I've done of that sort, asking how big is the gain and how big is the loss. Time to
One more question.
Okay.
I have a problem with the delineation between government and the market.
Okay.
Particularly when the government has just sold us a war that our children are going to be paying for forever. They control the market. The government controls, whether our buying power, just because we're saddled with this huge expense for so many years. Not to mention the fact that they regulate trade like NAFTA, and so many other aspects of foreign exchange for trade that the government is deeply involved in the market, and how can you separate them?
Yeah. The government is deeply involved in the market. It does not run the market in many cases. There are large areas of the market that operate relatively freely from government intervention and protect that right pretty strongly. The argument that the government can put us into a war and any expensive war is going to create enormous debt and change purchasing power and affect the economy for years to come. That's right, but I will also say that there are many reasons to argue against the current war that we're fighting in Iraq. Cost, to be honest, is a really small one. We are a very, very rich economy, and we could fight 5 and 6 Iraqs and almost never feel it in terms of the monetary cost. There's a whole lot of other costs there, both political and personal and everything else. But given the size of this economy and this level at which we've been fighting the Iraq war, it's not the argument for why we should be against what's happening in Iraq. I guess it's the impacts just aren't very big.
But the inefficiency
Yeah.
argument so far.
Absolutely, yeah. But it would be argument number 20 on my list of why I have difficulties with us being in Iraq, not argument number 1 or 2. So.
I want to thank all of you for being here and invite you to